All right, so hi y'all. I am Tom Wesselman. I work for Plantronics, and many of you probably know Plantronics, but what we build headsets, but really what it's about is helping people communicate. So if we're meeting in the hallway or something at lunch and we want to talk to each other, we just talk to each other, and it's normal. We wouldn't start texting or something. But if we're apart, we need to augment that reality with some way to communicate. And one way is to make a call, and then at Plantronics, what we want to do is make that remote communication as optimal as possible, right? The best user experience possible. So now with the combination of Internet of Things and augmented reality, we're trying to explore the idea of communicating with the world around us, and in the same way, make that communication as natural and human as possible. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So, getting started on the IoT side, there are a lot of things that are a little bit boring, right? And they've been boring for a long time. They just kind of trundled along. And suddenly, a lot of them have become more interesting or less boring. And they got great industrial design, and that's cool, and they're kind of nicer, but they basically do the same things. What sets them apart is being connected. So now I can not only have a thermostat on the wall, but I can access my thermostat remotely via my mobile app, and that's pretty cool. But it reminds me a little bit about the beginnings of the iPhone. When there was a magnetometer, right? You could tell the compass direction, so they built a compass. And there was a lightsaber. There was a very one-to-one relationship between the sensors in the phone and the hardware and the things you could do with it, right? And we're the same way, say, with a thermostat, where I can do the same things with a thermostat. It's a little bit more sophisticated, but it's basically the same as what I could do before, just remotely. So how do we go beyond that? Everyone talks about Pokemon Go, but it's a nice example of basically making the technology fade to the background. So people don't think about the sensors or the orientation of the phone. It's now become a virtual window, and that can augment the world around you with the Pokemon or whatever you want to do. And so there's really no thought of sensors and what's behind the curtain here that fades into the background. So beyond just providing content and making games, kind of what's the larger order goal here? A couple of weeks ago, my son sent me an article or a blog post called "Narrative is Everything, Everything is Narrative." And it really made me think. And at the same time, I've noticed the word story and storytelling and this whole concept come up a lot more in technology in the past months and year. And so it seems like the higher order thing is what is the story you're trying to tell? And rather than just getting barraged with little bits of information, kind of pull it up to the next level. And we've seen social media evolve into this with Snapchat and now Facebook Your Day, rather than just seeing like, okay, Morgan did this and Caitlin did this and all this barrage of stuff. I can kind of dive a little deeper and see what happened and kind of tell the story of the day. So one role you could imagine for augmented reality is to kind of roll that back to the beginning of the day and say, this is the story I would like to tell, and somehow have the user communicate that to the system, whatever it is. And how do I augment your reality to make that story happen over the day? I've called it before facilitated serendipity. Like wandering around here, I've run into a huge number of people like, oh my gosh, you're the best, you're amazing, we got to connect, we got to talk and stuff. But it's random. It's like I sat down next to this person and he happened to be amazing, and or at lunch. And so how do we make that happen more, that type of thing, and enable that story to be told at the end of the day? So whenever anyone brings up here the enterprise, right, and the office, it's kind of a groan-up, like, okay, now you're taking all the fun out of the technology and making it real. But beyond the money, this is what we do, right? I love creating games and creating, all this cool stuff or telling stories, but we spend most of our lives actually trying to get stuff done in the real world. And I think there's an incredible number of use cases where it might not be as exciting to augment my reality by helping guide me to this conference on time, or get me to the meeting, or remind me, or make my day more effective, or my team more effective. But it's much more meaningful in the end, probably. And certainly there's a lot of business opportunity there. So in that vein, you could kind of imagine Uber as a short story. So it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But it's a little bit of a boring story, right? It's just getting from one place to the other. So in writing, there's the concept of a frame story and embedded stories and stories within stories. So a good story isn't that simple as you learn in 9th grade. It's a layered narrative. And so the Uber fits in within the narrative of attending this conference, which has many components to it. There's a story about checking into the hotel, which is part of a larger hotel stay. And then there's a story about my career and where it's going and what we want to do and what my company wants to do. That intersects with all of your stories out there and how they intersect, and kind of not just saying we have stuff in common, but we have a story in mind or a story in progress, and it intersects in some interesting way. And then that intertwines maybe with a health story, which would involve AR getting me out of bed early so I could go work out before I come do this. So this new normal that we've all been exploring over this conference of everybody's connected to everything and all the things around us are connected, and what does that mean? How do we keep this from becoming like the Minority Report, or just barraged by things coming at us? And I think it's, in some sense it's new, but it's also a very old progression of technology where new technology tends to, you have to get on technology terms. Like the first computer, you had to go to the computer room and go use the computer there. And then there was the home computer. All right, I can go home, or the office computer, and I can sit there and use the computer. And then that exploded into laptops and cell phones and this quiver of devices we have today. And then that explodes and continues exploding into like IoT around us and wearable technology that's stuck to me. And all of this, as the technology fades into the background, how do we control this? How are we going to manipulate it? Not just have it come at us, but how do we share our will with it? Because it's going to be complicated. So one way to do it is with your thumbs, and that's kind of the predominant way today, is walking around. But I'm fairly sure that in 50 years, this is not how we're going to communicate with technology. Thinking more broadly, or it's kind of the default way of using technology now if I'm in a mobile form factor. But I found these two pictures. What do these two have in common? Anyone guess? They're both world record holders in their respective tasks. So Marcus on the left is the world's fastest texter, or Marcel. He can type 86 words per minute with his thumbs, which is really darn impressive. But so can my Aunt Judy with a typewriter or a keyboard or whatever. She would use a typewriter. But, and actually the world record for typing is 212 words a minute. Voice is 637. That's a really fast talker. But still, voice is a very high fidelity way to communicate. And so how can we kind of augment the human in the best possible way? And we believe that's really done best with not saying it's this or it's that, but rather just as we work in the real world with a variety of senses, and we adapt. We might gesture, I might hand you something to look at, we might talk. When we're apart, we could text, email, all kinds of things. How do we do that again with all our senses, as you can see there? And as we're designing interfaces, think less about, okay, what technology do I have? I have a HoloLens, so let's do something for the HoloLens. Or I have this piece of thing. Instead, kind of turn it inside out and say, I have this human who wants to do this, and as they move through their world and through their day, how do I best communicate with them and also then receive input from them about what they want to do? So one interesting thing about these, we have many senses, but most of them are read only, right? My eyes can see, but they can't send much. There's a little bit of gaze, but that's kind of esoteric. Nose, pretty limited. Your options are really voice and touch. So how do you exploit those? But there's a nuance here in that light, as we perceive it, is not translated. It's literally light. And so if you augment reality with light, you're going to take something that we would recognize in the physical world, or at least an imaginary world, and then send that light to us, and it's not translated. When we communicate, one way to think about it is, okay, there's sound waves going from her to him, but that's not really how it works. There's a big translation layer in the middle called language. And we're very limited and constrained, and enabled at the same time by our language, and that kind of defines what we can say. And in general, with tools, like any tool, there's been a progression over the years. The phone we have today, whatever we have today, the hammer we have today, has evolved over the years to be much better than it was before. Yet there's an interesting reaction to the idea of innovation in language. So we have 8th grade grammar class, 9th grade, whatever. Those are taught as the rules, and that's okay. There are some rules. It's good to know things, even if Siri can't tell the difference between there, and there. And it's kind of the same as in, say, programming class in 8th grade. You learn the basic rules, like where the semicolon goes and, say, always use tabs, not spaces. But with programming, that changes. You go to college, and you have fresh approaches to things and new ideas. So you could imagine Larry and Sergey being told by their Stanford professor, if they were in a grammar innovation idea, that, no, that's not how it's done. On page 186, it clearly outlines, here's how you build a search engine, and what you did is not that, so that's wrong. And I think it's interesting to look at innovation around the world. So is anyone here from the South? Yes, the south of anything, Southern Hemisphere, Southern California. While I was researching this, I found a very interesting correlation between the South and some attempts at innovation, and the North as it being kind of stodgy about language and uptight about it. So all these things, second person plural in English is just a known language flaw. There's no way to do it. And there are all these ways around it. I learned yesterday, we actually had one. In Shakespeare's time, we had ye, like hear ye, right? That was y'all. But we got rid of that for some reason. So now it's just a flaw. Antwoord in South Africa is famous for using this dialect called Zef, which is really kind of cool and innovative, but it's absolutely frowned upon, as putting it mildly, right? It's hated by everybody. It's just a terrible thing. Valley Girl from California, if you're older. And then the one that people do like is Aussie slang. Yet it doesn't really get out of Australia very much and get used in mainland. So I'll propose that if we're going to use language as a way to communicate with the world, we're going to have to rethink our idea of what language is and kind of embrace the idea of a language. When I discuss this with people, people brought up Esperanto as like, oh, you want to do this universal language. And it's actually kind of the opposite of that. It's diversionary. You can imagine like an Apple language that's optimized for Siri and some fighting with Google over Google language and whose language is better, right? And languages for communicating maybe in the aerospace industry or the military. There are all kinds of, there are whistle languages that people use for communicating over long distances, click languages. One of the challenges walking around with a headset on your head is people think you're talking to them. And so they get confused about who you're talking to, or they think you're crazy or whatever. But what if like click languages, like a yes was like 2 clicks, and we could get good at making those click noises. Other people are really good. And you could talk to technology in a very different way than how we talk to today. So it's kind of out there, but the idea is, how could we really think about what potential we have as a human to communicate with not just other humans, but to this world and what that means. How do we express things? Oh, and I was very excited yesterday that our president is on board with us. And so we share one thing in common now. He's also interested in innovation and language and new words. And just a little picture from Star Trek when they beamed down to Earth, they picked up the mouse and tried to speak with it, right? It's to them, to Hollywood. I think Hollywood has a very good impression of how humans work, much better than the Valley. And voice was the answer there on Star Trek. With the end result being not so much oh, we've voice enabled this or voice enabled that, but how do we make people feel like superheroes? And this is very testable in a lean startup way. So how do you say, what makes you feel great at the end of the day? So if you were at the end of the day to say, this is the best day ever, it was just awesome, this and this and this happened, how could we enable that to happen? And that would be pretty cool to do. All right, that's it.